There we go. All right. This is our third lesson on this series. We're in chapter 2 of the book, and I sent out a revised copy of the book. Today I made several changes, additions. I added another appendix to it. So we'll be looking at that a little bit later. We have to understand why the study of the flood is so important, because one of the first attacks the atheists make against the Bible is on the basis of the flood. There's 11 chapters of Genesis. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are the battleground with atheists, because creation, did we evolve? Macroevolution, was geology, does it explain, modern geology, does it explain the earth, or does the Bible with the flood explain the earth? So they attack creation, they attack the flood, and then they attack the Tower of Babel, the confounding of the languages. So these are the three big areas of attack by atheists. Our young people need to be grounded in this so they won't be pulled away. But so they attack the flood. Biblical theism, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about belief in the God of the Bible. No other God exists anyhow, so we're not worried about that. But when I talk about theism, I'm talking about biblical theism, Bible, the belief in the God of the Bible. Geologists, one of the first things they attacked, and this began around 1830. We're going to go through some of the history of it just real quickly. But they attacked the flood. And the ones that were attacking the flood were actually people who claimed to believe in God. And so some of this stuff came out of people who claimed to be Christians. So keep that in mind. Even people who believe in God can be led astray by false teaching, such as how evolution occurred. The claim that evolution brought life rather than creation, or that the flood didn't exist, or that it was just a local flood. So we're going to relate to some of these, relate to how the flood has occurred that's recorded in the Bible. Is the Bible correct when it records a flood? That's our question. If the Bible is right when it gives an account of the flood, what was the nature of the flood? Was it a local flood, or was it a worldwide flood? Now, again, many people who claim to believe in God take the position the flood was local. And so what we get into is it worldwide? Was it worldwide? Was it merely just a local flood? And so there are implications to taking both positions. The implications are far-reaching, I believe. And what were the conditions that caused the flood? I take the position it was a worldwide flood, and I reject the merely local. It was local everywhere, if you want to be that negative about it. But it actually was a worldwide flood. The destruction was throughout the whole world. What were the conditions that caused the flood? Again, we get into problems with people's misunderstanding of the Bible itself. We've already shown that the Bible talks about 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but it also talks about the fountains of the deep being broken up for 150 days and the windows of heaven open for 150 days. So the 150 and 40 don't fit together. They must be something different. That's what we're going to be dealing with as we deal with this. What was the antediluvian? And ante, if you know Latin, ante is the word before. Diluvian is a flood. So this is ante is before in Latin, and anti is against in Greek. So don't confuse them here. So ante is Latin and anti is Greek. So what are the pre-flood conditions, the before the flood conditions upon the earth? What was the earth like? Now, of course, if the Bible gives an answer to any of these, that settles the whole matter for a Bible believer. We'd have to drive a stake in the ground, as we said in the first two lessons. We drive this stake in the ground, and the Bible, what it says, has to be harmonized. We have to harmonize what we say with what the Bible says. And so we don't work it the other way. We don't twist the Bible to fit what we think. When did the flood occur is another good question. Right? Now, it depends upon which text we use for the Old Testament. But if we use the Masoretic text, one that King James American Standard came from, we get about roughly 2500 BC. If we take the Septuagint text, it pushes it back another 300 or 400 years. But whichever we take, between 2500 and 3000 BC, somewhere thereabouts. So, and I'm in the position it probably was around 2900 BC. All right. And that the creation occurred in about 4700, 4800 BC. All right. But I'm going with the Septuagint text for reasons we set forth last week. Okay. Any questions so far? What effects did the flood have upon the earth and all living things? Now, a local flood would have a different effect than a global flood. And of course, I've taken the position, we're going to take this whole course, that it was a universal destruction throughout the whole world. And a local flood won't do that. We gave some arguments against the local flood already. Why did God send the flood? Of course, the Bible explicitly tells us in the 6th chapter of Genesis why he sent it. All right. And that's one reason. Now, there may have been other reasons why he sent the flood. But when God gives us a reason, that is one reason. There may be others, however. What lessons, for instance, we may find out in Acts 2:38 what purpose of baptism is. The other verse might use a different terminology for what it's for. It may have more than one purpose. And the flood, we know it was sent because of wickedness of man, Genesis 6. Right? What lessons do we learn from the account of the flood? So what are our lessons we're going to learn from the flood when we look at the account of it? All right? Now, whenever we are looking at God and throughout the Bible, God has two means by which he could do something. And he could do it by miraculous means. God was capable of performing miracles, and that time he did perform miracles. So some claim the flood was miraculously brought about. Some that talk about the flood, and there are people that say there was a universal flood, but they say God brought it by miracles. And then others will say he brought it by providential means. And then others say it's a combination of these two. So we know God worked miracles. We know he works providence. So I would say, as I understand the Bible, that there's only two possibilities here. It's got to be either only miraculous, only providential, or a combination. Any fourth suggestions anyone has? All right. Now we have to ask the question then, under what conditions will God employ miraculous means to accomplish his will? So we have to let the Bible answer that for us. Because if the conditions of the flood weren't the conditions that God would use to perform miraculous, then the flood must have been brought by providential means. So that would be our argument. So we have to examine the possibilities here. And that brings in the question, was it miraculous, providential, or a combination? Now, questions that atheists have asked, we'll come back to the question about providence and miracles in a few minutes. Among the difficulties that defy credible scientific treatment for the deluge are, I've got a quote here from an atheist book, the source of the flood waters. That's a good question. Where did the waters come from? And then they use an expression, how did you drain the pond? And of course they do this to make fun. So how was the pond drained once it got full? And so my flood model explains all this. But some flood models have trouble with it. So we have to ask ourselves, can we explain their questions? What is the source of the flood waters? Okay, that's their first question. And explain the layering of different kinds of fossils in the rock strata. For instance, there'll be layers of marine fossils out of the ocean, and then there'll be terrestrial or land-based fossils. Then there's some more marine fossils, back and forth. They go back and forth. And of course, atheistic geology says the Earth went through millions of years of ages and eons of time, and this happened. Okay, they have problems. We're going to lay out the problems the atheists have. But see, some of the flood models won't explain this very readily. Right? For instance, if the common view is that the rain caused the flood and is the only cause, and if that's true, the rainwater will run from high ground to low ground. It always runs downhill. That's just the nature of water. And what happens is that things would wash from the high ground to the low ground. You wouldn't have this marine fossils coming in over the land. So we have a problem there if we take the position that's commonly held by many people, that the 40 days of rain was the only cause of the flood. I say there were three causes of the destruction. And there were three causes. I think they're laid out in the scriptures. 40 days of rain, 150 days of breaking up the fountains of the deep, which I believe to be the oceans, and then 150 days of the windows of heaven, which I believe to be something else, which we'll get into later. Okay. Now, so the layering of different kinds of fossils, my model explains it quite readily. Some models do not. And the sheer quantity of fossils. My model will explain why before the flood there was a massive quantity of fossils to be layered and deposited, because the pre-flood conditions, antediluvian conditions, were such that the soil was super fertile. The atmosphere had characteristics that will make people be able to live much longer. The Bible says people live to be over 900 years old, and it makes perfectly good sense. If the people were that healthy, the animals would also be that healthy. Conditions had to be very good for people to live that long. And if they did, we would assume the animals and plants also live that way. And so that would give us vast numbers of fossils deposited. Lots of animals in the ocean full of animals. The sheer quantity of fossils, I don't have a problem with it. I think we can explain it. But the model and it goes back to the pre-flood man. The Bible, I don't try to change the years. Methuselah lived 969 years, and the year is not a month. You can't reconcile it that way. There's no error in the Bible there. And so people living to be nearly 1,000 years old, they had to be super healthy. And they're different than us. Structures obviously formed on land and now buried deep in the rock strata. Again, a flood, particularly a flood of the nature that I'm going to postulate, would I believe explain that. Now, this is in a book called Scientists Confront Creationism, and I've got the reference here. This woman named Godfrey is the editor of it, and a bunch of people wrote, and I have the book and I've gone through it, and I've answered a lot of their stuff. And here's a picture of the lady and one of the men that's with her on this. So she's, if you look her up on the internet, she's a rabid atheist. Okay, rabid. Okay. Any questions? I mean that in a bad sense. I mean, she just goes after real hard, pushing her atheism. Some people think the flood only lasted 40 days. And of course, the Bible doesn't say that at all. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day where all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. Right? So now there's two factors here, windows of heaven and fountains of the deep. And so we find this is on the 600th year, second month, 17th day of the month. On chapter 8, verse 13, it came to pass in the 601st year On the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dried. And the second month, the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dry. Now, if you add your time in, it's a little over a year that he was in the ark. Noah and his family were in the ark, and the animals were there for a little over a year. Okay? So the flood lasted over a year. You just do your calculations. Just a little bit over a year it lasted. Flood lasted. Are there questions? It didn't last 40 days. It lasted over a year. That's not a local flood. It doesn't fit a local flood very well. Many don't know that there were 7 clean animals and 7 birds were taken into the ark of each kind. Now, some read that as 7 pairs, and that's a possibility. So it's a little bit unclear what the Hebrew is saying there. And every clean beast thou shalt take to thee 7 and 7, right? And so they take that to be 7 pairs and 7 and 7, a male and his female. And the beasts that are not clean, 2, the male and his female. I take that to be 7 pairs. And some take it to only be 7 clean animals, 7 animals, not 7 pair. So again, the wording is a little bit unclear. It doesn't really matter to us as far as our flood model is concerned, but that fits what we see here now. Okay, could be 7 pair, could be 7 of that kind. Of the birds also, the having 7 and 7, male and female, to keep seed alive on the face of all the earth. So right here we have 7 and 7. Now the clean animals, when he came out of the ark, he sacrificed them. If there were 7 of them, then he took one of the males and sacrificed him. So this was after they come out of the ark, but we won't spend time on that. But if you study that, that's very interesting. That's a great sacrifice. All these animals he could eat, he has to sacrifice one of them out of the ark. Most think the expression windows of heaven refers to the rainfall. Yet the rainfall in Genesis 7:4 lasted 40 days, while the windows of heaven lasted 150 days. Here are passages for it. And yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So now let's stop here. He gives him a warning. In 7 days, the rain's going to start. Now, we'll come to other questions. Did Noah have to round up the animals? And the answer is no. We'll show that. God sent the animals. He caused the animals to come in. Did he have to pick the animals? No, God chose them. God chose the ones that came into the ark. Now, let me illustrate this. There are differences in various dogs, for instance. We have dogs that are quite large, such as the Russian or the Afghanistan wolfhound, quite large, St. Bernard, or the little Mexican Chihuahua. They're all dogs. And God sent one of that kind, a pair of them, on the ark. And then all the other ones came out of them. And we'll be studying that, how that can happen. And we can see that happen very quickly. And I'll give you documentation from scientific evidence that it's occurred very quickly. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the ground. I think we see a purpose here of something happening. God sent the flood because of sin, Genesis 6. But he's going to destroy every living thing from the face of the ground. He's going to wipe everything clean, start all over. And so things are going to be different. Well, we can look carefully and we see the longevity of man goes down rapidly. We saw that last week. We looked at it. So the longevity goes down. I think there's a reason for this in Ecclesiastes 8. Because sentence against the evil works is not speedily executed. Therefore, the hearts of the sons of men are fully set in them to do evil. So, because people live so long, they got more wicked. When we see the end of our life coming very shortly, or we're not going to live much longer. As old as I am, if I live 30 more years, I'll be a very, very old man. And so when we look at it here, I know 30 years is probably, I'm going to be dead within 30 years, and most likely much sooner than that. And so I have to think about the end of my life. So I see it differently than I would if I had 700 more years to live, 800. That's a big difference. We have to understand that.
So
I think, go ahead.
Eat, drink, and be merry.
Yes.
He
Yes.
said eat, drink, and be merry.
Yes. If you're going 700 or 800 more years to live, well, I can straighten my life out 800 years from now. Okay. And I can have a good time for 700 or 800 years. Eat, drink, and be merry. I think we can see that in Ecclesiastes 8. In Genesis 7:24, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Assuaged means they've decreased, began to decrease. So right here we see another thing that was really important. The waters prevailed, continued for 150 days, but only rained 40. So if the waters didn't begin to diminish at the time the rain stopped, the rain wasn't the major factor in the flood. It occurred, and it was a factor, but I don't think it was a major factor, because it had quit for 110 days, and then the waters began to decrease, and they prevailed. And so there was a wind also, and we have to ask ourselves, what causes winds? And we'll be looking at that. Believe it or not, we have tides in the ocean, which are like water that turns in a circle, rotates. And so it rotates in one direction in the southern hemisphere and another direction in the northern hemisphere. But the water in the oceans rotates in a circular rotation that gives you your tides. And of course, it's caused by the moon and the sun, the two primary sources of tides. And your other planets like Jupiter are affected slightly. But we also have tides in the air. The air actually rotates about 1/20th of a mile per hour due to tidal action. And we have tides in the surface of the earth itself. The rocks actually go up and down every day. Believe it or not, we'll give the documentation of how much. I'll give you scientific evidence for it. Satellites can measure it. And so we have tides in the land, called solid tides. But here, there's a wind. So tides cause winds, but winds are also caused by a difference in temperature of air. So there's several things that cause winds, and two of those I just gave you here. So right here, there was a wind that passed over the earth, and the waters then assuaged or went down. The fountains also of the deep and windows of heaven were stopped. So they began to stop at that time and rain from heaven. Now, we told you last week, there are two different Hebrew words for rain. And so when we read it, we read the same word in English, but the Hebrew had two different words. So I take this rain stopped from heaven, and it stopped after 150 days. So we have 150 days of the mountains of the deep, and we have 150 days of the windows of heaven. And that rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from off the earth continued, and after the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. So they decreased after 150 days. 110 days after it quit raining, the waters began to decrease. That tells me that the rain was not a major factor in the flood. It was a factor, but I believe it was only a minor factor. Questions so far? Again, we're getting all this from the Bible itself. We have to drive a stake in the ground. The Bible has to be right there. We have to tie everything to the Bible. And that's our rule. That's a rule I'm going to follow. Most view the ark as being designed like a modern sailing ship. You can see in literature that's put out for teaching people, and you'll see the literature, and it'll be sharp-pointed and streamlined like a boat. Well, there's no need for that. It was a barge. All its purpose was to float. And it didn't have a rudder, didn't have a sail. God was in control, and I believe providentially in control, and he could have been miraculous, however, of the ark where it went. And the ark was going to float. Now, I've added to the book, and I'll be adding another appendix, and that's the seaworthiness of the ark. And so we'll be dealing with that. And I got an appendix already in the book that we were sent. And so I'll be adding to that. Most view the ark as designed like a modern sailing ship, but this is not what the Bible describes. The word ark is a word for a chest or a coffer, like a box. Most of us, when we buy a pair of shoes, we get a shoe box and it's rectangular. I think the ark was just like a giant shoebox, about shaped like a giant shoebox. And it's a wooden chest or a coffer or a chest. And that's what it's described as. And it didn't need to be streamlined there. Why? Because it wasn't designed to go through the water. It's just designed to float and save the lives. Now, well, look at this. If you streamline the boat, that creates some problems. And we'll see some of the problems that it'll create. Number one, you reduce the size of the volume of the boat by making the corners rounded. Number two, the wood in it becomes harder to deal with and make it where it will not leak. Whereas if it's square or rectangular, like the Bible describes it, it will tend not to have as many problems, and it will have more volume to it. Okay? And again, why do we streamline a ship? Well, so it can go through the water easier. Well, if God's just letting it float, it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to be streamlined. It was designed to float. It's not streamlined like a ship. Any questions? It's not described as being streamlined. It's described as being a box. It's a big box that floated. And it was made by God's decree, and God made it right. And he made it so it would float. I'll try to get the documentation. I think it's in the book here somewhere, and I'll check and make sure it is. If it's not, I'll put it in. But there was a study made. In aircraft, they have what they call wind tunnels. They'll put an aircraft model into a wind tunnel and put the wind and see how it reacts to wind. They'll do the same thing with ships. They're like a wind tunnel, but they put water put it in a water tank, and they make waves and so forth. And they did this, supposedly a fellow did this from Canada. He did it on the ark, the shape of the ark, the dimensions. Now, he didn't build a big ark, he built a model, and he made it square box, and like the Bible describes it. And he put it in this tank, and they made waves. And he concluded that ark would ride out 1,000-foot high wave without capsizing. That's what his conclusion was when he projected, and the ark being about 450 feet long. That is amazing. And the Dutch built ships by that same model, that same shape. And their ships, they used to use them for trading ships. They weren't very fast in the ocean, but they held a big volume, and they were very seaworthy. So again, they just picked up on God's model. That's what they did. We know God does everything right. Any questions? God put pitch. Noah put pitch on the ark because God told him to. And pitch is black in color. It's bitumen. It's basically like tar. Now, I think the tar was there to help it keep from leaking. I can't prove that. The Bible doesn't say, but that's my conclusion. And he put that pitch on that ark for the purpose of making it where it was not leak water. But he did what God said, and it worked. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark. And the word rooms is the word for nest in other parts of the Bible. So the animals were put in their cages or nest. Shalt thou make in the ark, and shall pitch it within and without with pitch. And so both outside and inside was pitched, covered with this black, probably a black tar-like substance, and pitch. I think to keep it from leaking, but I don't know that for a fact. It's just my theory. Any questions about that? All right. What's gopher wood? Someone's going to ask. I don't know. The word gopher is the Hebrew word. It's transliterated. In the New Testament, the word baptizo is transliterated as baptize. It's not translated. If you translate it, it'd be immerse or dip. Dip, plunge, or immerse. So right here, the word gopher is the Hebrew word gopher. They don't know what kind of wood it is. Some translations have translated as cypress wood. The NIV and another one have, I think, New Revised Standard, I think. But anyhow, the NIV, I'm pretty sure has. But there's a couple of translations. I looked them up, and they translated as cypress wood. It could be cypress. I don't know. I think let's leave it as gopher wood, and that's just transliterated. We don't know what kind of wood it is. However, let me point out, it was the best wood for the job. How do I know? Because God decreed it. So I know it was the best. And what is some of the best wood for shipbuilding? Teak. Teak wood is some of the best wood for making ships. I would say rather than cypress, although cypress makes good ship timbers, I would say teak, if I were guessing. But again, that was nothing but a guess. Any questions or comments? Teak trees get quite large. They grow in places like India and places like that, Burma and that part of the world, Thailand, and places, Indonesia. Okay. Any questions? All right. Ark has 3 stories or floors in it. And again, this was in order to hold. Now, the light shalt thou make in the ark, and that's a window basically, and a cubit shalt thou finish it upward, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third story shalt thou make it. Now, I'm not going to get into the design of the ark. I know what he tells us here, and I know there's 3 stories in it. And one of the theories is that he put the food for the animals in the top floor and put the animals in the lower floors. Now, why? Well, he could easily, if God had chutes designed, he could slide the food down to the animals through chutes, and it would make it less labor intensive. I know we don't know how he did it, but I'm saying it's possible God did it that way. Some atheists claim that those 8 people, Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their wives, they could not take care of those animals, all those animals during that time. If God designed the ark to make it easy to move the food around, it could be done. I believe God could design it right. And so, again, the atheist is saying it's not possible. Now, I have a reference to a book, and it deals with the ark. And this fella did a study on feeding animals, like in zoos and feedlots, like they do feeding cattle and hogs and things. And he said it's possible to do that. And he documented all of his evidence. And I've got the book referenced. I'll get you the name of the book, but it's in my references. You'll be able to find it. I'll give it to you later. Okay? All right. So again, the 3 floors. Why? Possibly the top floor was where we would put the food and just slide it down chutes and other things. Taking it down is easier than lifting it up and carrying it up. So I would say that might be the case. Could be at the top floor was for storage of food. Right? Any questions? And we don't have to know. Okay? God took care of it.
Is it possible that some animals hibernated?
And I think some of the animals could have hibernated. So certainly that's certainly possible. I would not rule that out. I'd say that's probably likely to be the case. Pretty likely. Bears hibernate, and God could have put a lot of the animals into hibernation state. But he did bring food onto the ark for thee and for the animals, see? So there was food brought on the ark for the animals and for man, for thee and for the animals, the scriptures tell us. I'm not reading that passage right now, but it's there, okay? You can read Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9, you'll find it, all right? Particularly in chapter 6. Some have attempted to replicate the ark, And there's a place around Cincinnati, Ohio, where they've made one. I want to see it sometime. My daughter lives up there in that area, and so I want to go by there and see it. But they've attempted to replicate it. But I've seen a picture of theirs, and they made it a little bit streamlined, which I don't go for that. But that's okay. They've done a lot of research. I want to go by there and see it, so it's not far out of my way to go that way. I have to go through Tennessee. Sorry about that, Shane, but I have to go through Tennessee to go that way. But that's okay. I have friends in Tennessee. Some have attempted to replicate the ark, but all that can be obtained is the general shape. And I think it was probably rectangular, probably not streamlined. Okay. We do have the dimensions, and this is how thou shalt make it, it being the ark. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, the breadth of 50 cubits, and the height 30 cubits. So we have 300 by 50 by 30. So it's 50 cubits wide, breadth, and it's 30 cubits high. Now, a cubit is the measure of a length from an tip of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger of a man. And so that's one way of measuring things. In the United States, among horses, they measure them by how many hands high they are. By hands, they still do that. We have a measure called a foot. It was the length of some king's foot. A yard was 3 feet, and it was from the tip of the nose out to the tip of the finger when the hand is extended, the arm is extended. So these were all certain measures, and these measures were measured off by a human body. So you carry your measuring stick with you. Your arm, you just do it out there and count it off. So what we run into is a cubit would be about 18 inches for a normal man. Now then, I believe it was Noah's cubit. Noah lived to be he lived over 900 years. He was 600 years old when the flood came. Do you think he was a healthy man? I think he was. So if he was healthy, could he have been taller than me? Well, most likely. If he was 6'6" or even 7 foot tall, he could easily have had a cubit that's 20 inches long, 20, 22, 23 inches. So I don't know how long the cubit was. It was Noah's cubit. I'm almost sure of that. And so whatever his height was, and I don't view him as an unhealthy man living. I think he was around 950 when he died. So I would say if we take a cubit being 18 inches, that gives us a distance here. If we take it 18 inches or 46 centimeters, then if we do this, 300 cubits would be 450 feet. So you multiply by 1.5. 30 cubits, 50 cubits, and 30 cubits would be 450 by 75 by 45. So it would be 45 foot high, 75 foot wide, 450 feet long. If they took my cubit, which is about 18 inches. And if Noah was taller than me, it could be farther. It could be like nearly 500 feet. There's a lot of volume in there. The atheists have said, well, you couldn't put all the animals on the ark. But studies have been shown, and I will document them, that you could get the species all on the ark. Now, what would God bring on the ark? He would bring the animals that were going to be preserved. Now, would he bring a full-grown animal? Could he not bring a juvenile animal, smaller? Surely. And it's going to live longer and reproduce. So he might bring a juvenile animal that's smaller and takes up less space. God was in charge, and it makes perfectly good sense to me that he'd bring juvenile animals rather than full-grown animals. So when he brings them on, some of your animals, if he brought them on as their juveniles, they can survive, and they'll begin to reproduce not long afterwards. Okay? But again, the ark is big. It's a huge craft, and it's very large. Now, the American, some of the ships in the U.S. Navy are bigger than this for sure. but we have here, and here we have in the U.S. Navy, the aircraft carriers are quite a lot larger than that. So let's move on. Okay. Atheism requires the theory of macro-organic evolution. Now, the word macro is from a Greek word meaning large scale. So we have large scale evolution occurring. This is the amoeba to man evolution, and the spontaneous generation theory. So that's what we run into. Macroevolution, according to Merriam-Webster, is evolution that results in relatively large and complex changes, as in species formation. And so I would say amoeba to man. That's macroevolution. Most atheists, when they use the term evolution, that's what they're referring to. And so they just use evolution to depict that. And they're very subtle about this, and I think maybe even dishonest, because there's two kinds of evolution. There's macro and macro. We'll see the macro here. Macro is, and we get micro now. Macroevolution, notice the macro above. Macros is the Greek word for large. Macro is the Greek word for small. And so it's comparatively minor evolutionary change involving accumulation or variation of populations usually below the species level. Now, you can take cattle and breed them and change their characteristics within certain limits. You can get, by selective breeding, you can get cattle that are black or white or brown or spotted or with some that have horns. I'm in class. Call me back. Okay. Okay. All right. Sorry. Microevolution, comparatively minor. Macroevolution, I believe, occurs. What we have here is, I believe, with cattle, for example, they've bred cattle so that some of them don't even have horns. And then they have some that do have horns. And by selective breeding, they can get cattle that are what they call polled. They don't have horns. And there's some breeds that don't have any horns at all. That would be your Angus, for example. They don't have horns. But what we run into is that's within the genes that God created. So God created within the genes the ability to adapt to certain environments. And so adaptation. Microevolution, I believe in it, but I don't believe in macroevolution. So keep that in mind. Now, right here, Louis Pasteur demonstrated, this is a quote now from an atheist, and Louis Pasteur demonstrated that spontaneous generation of this type is impossible. That's macroevolution. He said it's impossible. Louis Pasteur was right. Okay. Pasteur's ingenious experiments and clear-cut results are still hailed as triumphs of the scientific method over mysticism and superstition. They thought an animal would just come out of the mud and so the mud would turn into a frog. Well, they saw frogs that had buried in the mud and they come out of the mud. So they reasoned that way. They were dead wrong, of course. It was just the frog was hibernating. His conclusion that no type of spontaneous generation is possible has proved to be short-sighted. In other words, what he proved, it doesn't fit what we want to have. We want to have spontaneous generation. Premature and somewhat of an embarrassment to the succeeding scientists. We're embarrassed because we want to have spontaneous generation. We want to have it sometimes, but not most of the time. If we discount the theory of spontaneous generation entirely, then the only alternative is supernatural creation. We might have to believe in God. I'm reading into what they said here, what they wrote, what he wrote. This is Stokes. This is a geology book. There are no other possibilities. He's right. If spontaneous generation did not occur, then there has to be God. There has to be creation. Science, therefore, finds itself re-examining the possibility of spontaneous generation. We got to go back and undo what Pasteur did. Okay. On the basis of present evidence, We know that living material apparently can originate only from previous living material. But there's a, I stop right there. I'll move my cursor right here. I want you to see this. If he'd stopped right there, it'd be dead right. Because he's dealing with a principle of biology called law of biogenesis. The law of biogenesis says living things come from other living things. But there's a possibility, he goes on and says, that it might rarely arise in some other method. See? Science is not seeking the spontaneous generation of fully formed organisms such as man, but on the simplest of living entities. So if it's a simple living organism, then it's okay to happen. But the foolishness of this is DNA is so complicated and RNA are so complicated that it can't occur mathematically. It just can't occur. The probability of occurring is ridiculously low. But we won't get off into that. I would just say right here, I reject macroevolution. And I think the scientists are irrational to accept it. They did not want to believe in God. If you read that carefully, you'll see that. Perhaps because it required them to control some of their actions, govern themselves, guide themselves. Romans 1:28 tells us why. And even as they refuse to have God in their knowledge, these people don't want to believe in God. God gave them up into a reprobate mind to do those things which are not fitting. So they want to do evil things and engage in activities that are sinful. They don't want to be controlled. Now, what we have here, we're down to almost the end of our class, this class today, and I'll go ahead and cover this and stop here. This links in with atheism, though. And of course, we have to deal with the motives and the modus of operation of those who oppose what we're saying about the flood. As the sun's first rays of thermonuclear light blazed across the galaxy 4.5 billion years ago, isn't that amazing right there? The primal Earth emerged from a spinning, turbulent cloud of gas, dust, and planetoids that surrounded the new star. During the next 700 million years, the cloud settled into a more tranquil solar system. Sun's third planet began to solidify. On these figures, for the age of the Earth, rest all of geology and evolution. I want you to see this. They have to have this time because they agree it's going to take billions and billions of years for evolution to occur because it's so improbable. They have to have certain conditions. We're going to look at the conditions next week that have to be there for this to happen. And then we've got the probability of putting the chemicals together in the right way to have all the DNA. And all of these things, of course, it's ludicrous. But what we have here, they're all tied together. Geology and evolution. You have to have geology to support evolution, evolution to support geology. Of course, that's circular reasoning. And of course, they have to have time. Time is one of their key elements. They have to have lots of time. And of course, the flood doesn't, if you take the flood model and that the creation was no more than maybe 5,000 BC, 4,800 or so, then you can have the time to have the organic microevolution to occur. And so they can't accept it because the consequence, you have to believe in God. Now, are there questions? We're going to stop here. Do you have any questions? Okay. Any comments? All right. We'll get out of the class.